Hi, everyone. Tonight we are going to go over logic models so that you have a little more sense of the requirements of this assignment, which is due on session 9 on March 8th. So one of the things that's important to remember about a logic model assignment is that logic models are not very verbose. So we don't want a lot of words and pages attached to the logic model. It's mainly about really good thinking and really good conceptualization and your ability to illustrate that on paper. So really, this is only a 4-page assignment, and 3 of those pages are your writing or the logic model narrative, and 1 of those pages is your actual illustration of your logic model, which is going to be customized to implement the program that you have identified in section 5 of the needs assessment in your findings section. So you at this point will have identified a program or a service that you would like to implement. And you are going to use that program implementation as the basis of your logic model. So this program or service may be broadly defined, but I would also like to suggest that you do some research on what similar programs look like. So for example, I used in our weekly video this week, I talked about one of my former students did a logic model and a program evaluation on social and emotional learning amongst elementary school students. So you can actually research or Google or use various search engines or academic articles to understand what are the components of implementing a social and emotional learning program for youth. And that kind of gives you a start to really understand the building blocks and components and the evidence base for the program implementation. So students implement all different kinds of logic models, all different kinds of services for this assignment. It does not need to be an evidence-based practice, but my suggestion is that you actually look online to determine if there's already been some formative research on your program or service that you want to implement, because that's really going to help you pull together the components of your logic model. Okay. So the first part of this is an introduction. This is the part where you are going to go into our Royce textbook, and you are also going to look in the literature to help define what a logic model is. So we require that you use our Royce program evaluation textbook that we've been using all semester, and that you include 1 additional citation to show us that you truly understand what a logic model is. Secondly, how do logic models inform social work practice? So how do they help us implement new practices? And what are the key limitations of logic models? That is all available for you in the Royce textbook. Second section is that we want you to describe the program or service for which the logic model will be created. So you can pull this from step 5 of your needs assessment when you describe the kind of program that you are going to implement based on your community participants or your population of focus needs. Okay, now number 3, you are actually going to develop the logic model containing the following elements. You have your inputs, activities, and outputs. So for your journals this past week, session 6, I have given you feedback on your inputs, activities, and outputs. So please refer back to my feedback, and you should have this part already completed. The only thing you have not done so far that needs to be added is looking at your intermediate outcomes. So this includes some iteration of the following. You should have some short-term and long-term outcomes. Sometimes students also put in middle of the range outcomes as well. It just depends on the kind of template that makes the most sense for your logic model. Okay, so in order to fully address this assignment guideline, you will provide the following. You will have a completed logic model template There are several examples we have provided for you under session 6. These are also very readily searchable on the internet. In fact, I'm going to share one with you in a minute that I just found on the internet not too long ago. I'd also advise you to go to the University of Wisconsin-Madison's website, where they have all sorts of logic model templates, and you don't need to fiddle around with, text boxes and flowcharts and arrows. You are more than welcome to use theirs, which at a minimum includes inputs, activities, outputs, intermediate outcomes, and final outcomes. So that's the very minimum. I'm going to show you one that has a little more complexity to it in a minute, just in case any of you choose that route as well. So we also require that you have a 3-page narrative that provides more detailed description that really supports your logic model diagram and chart. So we want to ensure that you've explained why you chose activities and how they logically lead to outcomes. So we want to think about, remember, outcomes are things we want to increase and decrease amongst our population of focus. So for example, decreasing substance use, increasing well-being. Just one example. So ensure that the items that are identified in the logic model template are clearly defined in the narrative. So that 3-page narrative is just more writing on the illustration that you have done of the logic model. So here are the basic components. We have inputs, activities, outputs, intermediate outcomes, and final outcomes. So inputs are variables that can be related to clients, staff, material resources, facilities, and equipment. So what are we going to need materially to begin this program? Activities are, what are we going to need people to do? What are we going to need the community to do? What are we going to need the staff to do? What are we going to need the clients to do? Any relevant service tasks or methods of intervention for each service. Outputs are the units of service for each service to be provided. Outputs can also include like takeaways, things left behind after your program implementation is complete. And let's say you leave these things with the organization. So for example, in the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians project, we left behind an onboarding manual for the family safety program and the training modules related to that. So again, that was outputs. Activities would be training people, developing the manual, etc. But outputs are things that are more physical. They can be left behind, their modules, their units of service, etc. Intermediate outcomes for each service being provided. Those can be things that are also known as like short-term outcomes, things that are going to happen maybe in the next couple of years. And then final outcomes tend to have a more community impact that is long lasting. So what I would suggest is you really brainstorm outcomes, things that are going to increase and decrease by virtue of participation in your program. And then you really organize them logically, trying to think of, well, what would happen in more shorter term and what would happen in more longer term related to seeing change. Lastly, you discuss how the logic model assists with evaluation design. So then what is your next step in terms of thinking about your program evaluation, your final assignments, and any concluding thoughts about logic modeling and the impact on program, agency, and community being served. So just to reiterate, 4 pages, 1 of those pages will be the logic model, 3 of those will be your written words, and we want you to do this in APA 7th edition. So really quickly, I'm also going to share with you a logic model that I think is pretty cool because it really helps you plug in some ideas. So again, we are mainly looking at this inputs, outputs, which include activities and participations, and outcomes, short-term, medium-term, long-term. However, this kind of leads to session 7's soft talk and thinking about formative and process evaluation, because it also has some extra bells and whistles on the logic model where we're identifying key elements of the situation and priorities, which include the mission and vision statements of the organization. So that's something that we learned about this week, week 7. So I thought it would be cool to include. Inputs are things, what do we need to invest in order to make this program run? So that is often staff, time, money, research materials, equipment, etc. Outputs include 2 things: activities, which are what do we need to do, what action we need to take to implement the program, and then participation. Who will we reach? Who will be the participants that will join us, and who will be the other key decision makers? People who will potentially policymakers, potentially customers, potentially staff. How will we need them to participate to make this project run? And then you want to think of this as really being implementing this arrow right here in between outputs and outcomes. That's when you want to think about imagining your program going there. So your program has been implemented, and then what can we imagine will be the outcomes? So what will be the short-term results? Potentially that's learning, awareness, knowledge. What will be the medium-term results, which often are things like actions, behaviors, change in practices, and long-term impacts, finally, are the ultimate impacts, which really has to do more with creating societal change. So conditions related to economics, civic engagement, community, the environment, etc. And then if it makes sense for you, you might want to think about what are some of the assumptions that are playing into my ideas around how this logic model can flow, and what are the external factors that can potentially create barriers and facilitators to implementation in my imagined outcomes related to this logic model. So that is all I have for tonight. We are again are having an asynchronous session 1 week before the logic model is due, and I'm going to link that in weekly session 7 and also emailing you that so you have your information. Please do not hesitate to reach out at any time if you have questions about the logic model. We're happy to workshop your paper with you. All right, take care everyone. Bye.